Hey everyone, we've been taking a look at art that's responding to World War One, and I want to take a look at art between the wars and how society is struggling to come to terms with a 4-year war that left 20 million dead, that left society decimated, and there's a feeling of uncertainty, a feeling of doubt, confusion, and the generation that lived through the experiences of World War One became known as the lost generation because they were spiritually, politically, socially adrift, and they just really didn't feel a connection to the values of tradition, the past, the things that they were raised with, honor, bravery, courage. Those all seemed meaningless in a world that seemed to be destructive and violent and chaotic. And so art represents those kinds of, it mirrors those kinds of sentiments. And there's where we see Dadaism capturing the essence that life feels random and chaotic. And so they're reflecting the randomness and chaos, the chaos of the world. I wanted to take a look at Surrealism today. And to start with this, I wanted to take a look at Giorgio de Chirico. Now, he's not a card-carrying member of Surrealism. He actually comes about before Surrealism. Surrealism dates to the late 20s and into the 1930s. De Chirico's before this, kind of right at the beginning of World War One, right, kind of before, and then kind of seeking to make sense of it during and after the war. And I think that's really gets his motivation or vision. But his ideas are very surrealist in a sense, right? They have commonalities in terms of style and ambiguity. So I think he's a good fit to introduce surrealism, even though he's not really officially a surrealist. De Chirico was an Italian painter whose works are typified by ambiguous, dreamlike images. He was heavily influenced by the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche, who we really haven't studied in this class, but Friedrich Nietzsche essentially argued that we need to completely destroy the political and social institutions that we have in order to start again, that they're so corrupt that we can take nothing from them. And if we preserve just even a tiny particle of these current social and political institutions, then the problems that they present will carry over, right? So if you, for instance, if you're tearing down a government in terms of a revolution, but you keep the political leaders intact, then they're just going to build the same system that they had before. So Friedrich Nietzsche argues for nihilism, Nihilism. Nihil means nothing, and then an ism just means a belief in nothing. And so the idea is to completely do an etch-a-sketch, clean slate, blank slate of society to start again. He believed that there was going to be what is known as an Übermensch, that's German for Superman, that was going to come and lead society to a better ideal. And being influenced by those ideas, he's suggesting that in a similar way that society is corrupt and needs to be reset, right? So De Chirico, influenced by Nietzsche's ideas, is suggesting, you know what, maybe we're heading in the wrong direction and we need something to lead and direct us to a better ideal. A lot of people associate Friedrich Nietzsche with atheism because he says that God is dead. But if you actually take a look at the quote where it comes from in the book The Gay Science, it actually is more of a sad commentary on the state of the loss of spirituality in the 19th century, and he's heavily concerned that people are lost and spiritually adrift, and that sentiment continues over in the 20th century. And so these sentiments of questioning the direction of where humanity is going is under the surface of a lot of the art of the late 19th and early 20th century. Getting back to Giorgio de Chirico, his works look like an episode of Life After Humans. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but essentially it postulates if humans just completely were no longer existence today, what would life look like? What would the planet look like in 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, right? So it's kind of this apocalyptic dystopian flair to it. There's a feeling of an apocalyptic event in each of them. And so in some ways, it's kind of surreal, it's dreamlike quality to it. But in the other sense, there's a feeling that something's happened. The streets are generally empty. and there's only maybe one or two people in them, or sometimes none. And it gives it a sense that something tragic is either on the horizon or in the near future, right? Thinking about this one, Mystery of the Melancholy Street. This is a good one to start with. It's the only DeChirico I'll talk about for this semester. But what we see here in the far right, left-hand corner is a little girl playing what was a game at the time. Essentially, just be a loop and a stick, and the idea was to try to run along to keep the loop going or the hoop going as long as one can. She's heading from the left to the right. But the silhouette, right? This kind of dark shadow, the sun, the lighting source, the sun's coming from the top right side, shining on her, leaving a dark shadow for us, the viewer, to see, gives her kind of an ominous feel, kind of like something's happened. Then, typical to DeChirico's works, the buildings are going to be really large, and the people, if they are there, they're going to be really small. And so they feel as though that the things that we create, such as our buildings, our trains, the things that of the modern world of technology has made us seem smaller. They've dwarfed us in the modern world to make us feel insignificant. And so we're going to see that lack of significance. Now, she's running from the left to the right, and then there's this other shadowy figure, which we don't get to see, off here on the kind of center top, that gives us another kind of feel, this kind of long, dark shadow, and we don't really know what that is. Maybe this is, I don't know, the Grim Reaper, it may be the Mother, it may be, I don't know, just an average person, but it gives it this kind of haunting feel to it, right, that we're not really sure. There's a lot of ambiguity in this mysterious street, hence the title, right? And then we have this wagon here with the doors open, but there's nothing in there. There's nothing else in the streets. It gives us the feel that there's something's happened and life has completely changed, and there's not a lot of people that fill the streets anymore, right? So the busy, chaotic urban centers that we've been examining the last several lectures is all gone in DeChirico. So something's happened to change that. So it gives it this kind of ominous or threatening feel. It seems as though there's this indication of innocence by the little girl, but maybe it's this naivete that she has, that she doesn't realize what's on the horizon. She doesn't realize what's going on in what she's heading to. And so in some ways, if you can kind of pull back just a little bit and think about the overall social historical context, he did this in 1914, perhaps, thinking about this as a reflection perhaps of the human condition, whether intentionally or unintentionally, he's just reflecting these ideas. It kind of gives us the sense that something's on the horizon that's going to be catastrophic, right? There's this naivete if we're heading in a direction, thinking that we're heading for the better, and it actually is going to lead to some type of, destruction, right? Thinking about surrealism, right? Surrealism, I don't know, it's not so dark as that per se, but in some ways it kind of is, right? It's doing something similar but something different. So let's take a look at the compare and contrast ideas of surrealism with Giorgio DeChirico, who is just kind of his own movement, doing his own thing pre-war. Surrealism is a more formal movement where a group of artists come together and they have a manifesto and say, this is what we're going to do. These are our attributes. This is what we're going to ascribe to. Surrealism was an art movement that began in the 1920s and was an outgrowth of Dadaism's critique on rational order. And a lot of the early surrealists initially were Dadaists, questioning the absurdity of life, questioning the idea that the absurdity that humanity can make sense of the chaos and confusion that surrounds us. The difficulty with that is that can only go so far before you start, going in a different direction, right? And so a lot of them moved or just kind of evolved into surrealism, and they're going to continue that critique of rationalism, right? Suggesting that the rational world is lost. So the place that we should turn to is the inner mind, right? We've seen that theme in modern art before. Surrealism was strongly influenced by Freud's structural model, believing that underneath human subconscious lie very strong sexual and violent desires that humans must repress. So he's thinking about what's beneath, what's motivating us, and what's motivating us is procreation and violence, right? And that's kind of we would consider that in the church the natural man, but he's suggesting if we really want to understand the true essence of humanity, we have to understand these motivations. Part of these motivations are the desire to reproduce, but a part of them is the fear of death, that we're trying to preserve our resources to put off, to procrastinate the day of our demise, that we subconsciously are afraid of that, so it's leading to violence and other things. But for society to function, we must repress those desires, otherwise it's just going to be pandemonium. Surrealists believe that the best way to understand humankind is through understanding our subconscious, meaning these desires that we repress. If you really want to understand who we are, don't look at the masks that each of us put on as we go out into the world each day, the clothing that we put on, the makeup, whatever that we put on to try to disguise who we really are. Don't look at those masks. Those masks only tell us the superficial elements of life. If you really want to understand what motivates people and who people really are, you got to peel back the mask and look what's underneath the surface, right? So surrealists believe that's the truer idea. That's thinking about truth. That's the truer way to understand the human condition and what motivates us. Hence, much of their works are dominated by dreamlike sequences with themes of sexuality, violence, fear of death, and the uncanny, right? Well, I'll take a look in just a minute at what the uncanny means. That's a Freudian term. But mainly there's going to be themes of sexuality, violence, fear of death embedded within surrealism, because they're trying to understand what's below the surface and what truly motivates us. They were influenced by Freud's structural model, which he came up with in the 1920s. And essentially, and you guys have probably seen this in other classes, this is quite common whenever someone talks about Freud, they talk about this particular model, and what he essentially argues is that there are social needs. Anytime we make a decision, we have to balance the social needs versus our individual needs, right? Thinking about the social needs, we have to balance what is legal, what is moral, what is necessary for our family, what's necessary for a community, versus our individual needs. What do I want, right? So for instance, whenever we generally tend to, in my family, want to watch movies on Friday night, right? So we all kind of gather together, we watch a movie together, and then we have the conflict of what choices are we going to make? How are we going to make this decision, right? So I have my own individual needs of the films that I want to watch, but I also have to balance that with the social needs of my family for the family to actually function. If it was just me deciding, it would not be a very functional, it would be an autocratic rule, which would not be great, right? So, and he argues in each decision that we make, whether consciously or subconsciously, we have to have that kind of battle, right? What is it that I want it right now versus what is it that what are the social needs, right? So as you guys think about studying, you have your own individual needs in terms of wanting to, get on social media or binge watch an episode of something, or, sleep. Versus the social needs of what society is, suggesting are the standards for, work or success in college, or, family needs of what they expect from you, et cetera, right? And so we have to balance that. And so he suggests that this battle goes on underneath the surface, and then we finally have to, sometimes our individual needs win out, sometimes our social needs win out. But essentially what he argues is he breaks it down into these three kind of areas. The id is all of the individual subconscious desires that we have, all those dark desires, just selfish needs that we have. And then the superego are the laws, the rules, the 10 commandments, right? All of the ideas and needs of society to function, saying this is how you should behave and this is how I want to behave. And he says for society to function, there needs to be a balance, and essentially that compromise occurs within the ego, right? So there's that balance, that tension, and then the ego tries to find some type of compromise between what we want and what society needs, right? So what the surrealists are focusing on in terms of trying to get underneath the surface, they're focusing on this, right? So they're peeling back the ego, they're peeling back the superego. They're not really interested in laws and rules and morality as much as they are interested in what's really below the surface. And they're not really interested in the compromise. They just want to know what's really motivating us. And so most of their works are going to be here, centered on these kinds of themes. Now, thinking about the uncanny is something that is familiar to us and foreign at the same time, right? So as we see here, this is a Chinese AI bot that they made, this robot that you can talk to and it can talk back. But it's creepy, right? We recognize it's kind of realistic, right? We recognize the hair, the kind of weird eyebrows, the freakish eyes, right? The face. But it's too real without being real enough, right? And so it's this kind of weird, we call it the uncanny valley, something that is familiar but also different and foreign at the same time. My family, we loved to read Polar Express when my kids were growing up, right before Christmas, right? Every Christmas Eve, we would read the Polar Express. They loved the book until the movie came out, and then the movie creeped them out, right? Because it was too real, right? Without being real enough, right? They wanted to make the characters look like they were actual people, but the technology didn't really catch up with it. So it would probably have been better if they just would have, leaned to the other side and did more of a cartoon version rather than trying to make it real and without making it too real, right? That kind of creepiness of it. And if any of you have seen The Boy, the movie, The Boy, a lot of it centers around this kind of creepiness where this mannequin looks kind of real, behaves kind of real, but yet not quite real. And so it creates that kind of creepiness. And so Freud argues that uncanny elicits an emotional response within us, right? We kind of react to it. And so surrealists have that kind of aesthetic within their works. Their works are going to be somewhat real, but yet not, to create that tension, right? So that's the uncanny. Thinking about Rene Magritte, I think he's a good place to start, even though Salvador Dali is the most famous one. Rene Magritte is a Belgian artist. And I think this one captures the essence of surrealism and the ideas of the uncanny, because as we take a look at this, we see that there's a window, and then we say, wait a minute, there's a painting in front of the window, right? So obviously the painter here is painting the outside window. And then we start to realize both of them are a painting. Both the easel and the window outside are all part of the same painting. And so the question of surrealism is, what is reality? Do we really even know what's real? If all of these desires and unconscious desires and motivations are driving us, they're shaping the way that we see the world, right? So if someone has trauma in their childhood, that's going to affect the way they perceive a given situation, right? And so the question is, do we even see reality, right? So here, I like this kind of quote here. We read space, but we know the painting on the easel is flat, and then we remember the whole painting itself is flat. What is real? Plan illusion implies that the painting is less real than the landscape, when in fact both are painted fictions. And so this is a big part of modern art in general, the idea that they're not trying to paint fictions, something that's real enough for a bird to land on it. They're trying to expose the fact that this art is the insights. It's made by an artist and has the artistic insights. It has the artistic motivations. It has artistic capability, has artistic prowess. It has all of these elements that make it a work of art rather than a work of reality. Because it's not reality, it's a fictional reality. It's a depiction of reality. And so what modern art is seeking to do is get us closer to truth, get us closer to what is real. And Rene Magritte has that idea, kind of exposing that in a playful way, that the paintings that we go and see, the works of art that we see that look real to us, aren't really real. And we need to be aware of that, aware of these artistic insights. I like this quote by an art critic about modern art. He says, where the old masters created an illusion of space into which one could imagine walking, right? So think Michelangelo, think Raphael, think Caravaggio. The illusion created by a modern artist is one into which one can travel through only with the eye, right? So more about the mind of the artist and the artistic insights than trying to create an illusionary space that someone can imagine walking through, right? So a different kind of emphasis, more about the ideas and the insights and the inspiration of an artist rather than the visual reality. Let's take a look at another surrealist, Man Ray. He is an American photographer, and he likes to balance this idea of the uncanny, things that look kind of familiar but also kind of foreign, to elicit a response. And we have to then start thinking, well, wait a minute, what is real and what is reality? How do we even come up with reality anyway, right? What our senses can be deceived, right? He's an American photographer and painter. He was brought up in New York and adopted the pseudonym Man Ray as early as 1909 as an artist. He was one of the leading spirits of Dadaism and Surrealism. So he's one of those artists that initially starts in Dadaism and then transitions into Surrealism. He was the only American artist to play a prominent role in launching two influential movements, Dadaism and Surrealism. So that's a pretty big accomplishment in and of itself. By 1921, Man Ray was eager to experience his European influences firsthand and went to Paris, where he lived for 20 years. But he maintains this sense of American identity. So let's take a look at Regalo. This is just an iron, right? So that in the old days, before they would plug it into the wall and have steam inside it, they would just make the iron hot and then they would, press the clothes. But here he attaches nails to them, or these spikes to them, to change its meaning. So again, we recognize the iron, we recognize the spikes, but together they create new meaning. Or the glass tears. We recognize the woman's face. We recognize what appears to be little glass beads, but together they create this sense of tears, right? So giving us new insights into something that is, somewhat ordinary, right? People having emotions and crying, but getting us to think about it differently, getting us to think about our world, the world around us differently. All right, Salvador Dali was the main surrealist. I think he's the most famous one that comes out of the movement. He focused on experimentation with identity and with his projection of his own persona, and may have developed out of an early understanding of himself as reply, a double, an absence, right? By 1928, Dali was moving towards surrealism, showing disconnected, ambiguous forms, right? So mainly the ideas that we see here, focusing on the id, the ideas of sexuality, death, right? Fears of death, and the uncanny, we see that illustrated with Dali, right? The fear of death, we have the face of war, and the face of war here is Medusa, right? Who, if we look upon her face, it turns us its own. She has hair that's made of snakes. And so it gives us this horrifying image that we recognize the eye sockets, we recognize the nose, we recognize the mouth, but inside the eye sockets in the mouth, there's another skull with inside that, there's another, within the eye sockets of the mouth, there's other skulls and so on and so forth, right? But the idea here is that he's questioning this notion of humanity and our propensity towards violence, to death, towards war, right? The face of war is destruction. He does this in 1949, a year after World War II begins. And so just as almost, a few years after World War I ends and we finally get some type of peace and beginning to get some semblance of structure, a couple of years later, you have World War II with Germany invading Poland and then England and France declaring war on Germany and then bringing, the rest of the world into it eventually in some way, shape, or form. And so we see that why is this propensity towards death with so many that died in World War I? You would think that we would learn our lesson for this. But yet we're still in this, we're kind of dragged into this again. And so I think Freud, or Dali's arguing, and to some extent Freud's arguing, that we need to really understand this propensity towards violence and destruction if we're to really understand the human condition. And maybe if we do that, maybe we can solve or stop things like this in the future. I like this quote. This quote comes from Freud's book called Civilizations and Its Discontents. And I think it captures an aspect of what Dali is responding to. Both of them, Freud wrote this in the 1930s, and Dali's painting this in 1940. So they're responding to the same ideas. Freud's doing it in psychology. Dali's doing it in art. So it's interesting to see that intersection, right? Responding to the same ideas, but in different fields. Freud says this: men are not gentle creatures, right? And I think he just means mankind. I don't know if it's necessarily gender specific, who want to be loved, who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked, right? So this idea that this romantic view of humanity, that we're just all good, right? We're creating the image of God, which is true. So therefore, right, the kind of next step for some would be then we're all naturally good. And he suggests that might be a little bit simplistic, because there's another side of humanity, right? We're not just creatures wishing to be loved and just defend themselves, or we're violent if necessary, right? He says they are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowment, meaning at our core, these are our instincts, right? It is to be reckoned as a powerful share of aggressiveness. So he says, at our core, we need to recognize that our instinct is to be aggressive. And that's a big assertion. And I think that's shaping the way that what his ideas are. And it's shaping the way that people are seeing humanity in the early to mid part of the 20th century, right? If humanity has an instinctual desire to be aggressive, what does that mean? And do we just embrace that? Or do we find a way to resolve it, right? So that leads to a lot of other kinds of questions. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to try to manipulate him in some way, to make sure that you don't pay him, to try to cheat him or her, to seize his possessions, to steal in some way, to humiliate him, to put him down or her down, to cause him or her pain, to torture, and to kill him, right? And that's pretty dark, that's pretty extreme. And we think about this, the idea of violence, but the violence doesn't necessarily have to only be physical violence. It could be emotional violence. It could be manipulation in some way. It could be verbal violence. And so he's not just saying that people just go up and, stab each other. He suggests that we tend to be very, very violent in a number of different ways. We could be passive aggressive, and that is its own form of violence that we're enacting, right? Now, we could take a look at this and say, again, well, I don't go out and, punch people or, verbally assault people. Yeah, I think that's good, and I think that's true. But I think he also suggests, if you take a look at the sports, the films that we watch, what do they tend to be filled with, right? The number one sport in the United States is football, right? We think about, is that violent? And why, right? As we think about the films that we watch, the number one grossing film of all time, The Avengers, right? And that's completely void of violence, right? So the question, and it's not, right? There's violence everywhere, right? So there's these desires, this kind of instinctual kind of pull towards violence, right? He says this, he says, Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to man. And he follows up, and I kind of like this cheeky question. Who in the face of all his experience of life and of history will have the courage to dispute this assertion, right? So he says, take a look at history, take a look at your own life, take a look at the news, whatever you want to do. This is aggression is part of who we are. And certainly if we think about the war in Ukraine, we see that it seems to be a propensity towards aggression. If we take a look over the weekend or a few weeks ago, there was the assault of Hamas in Israel, and now that there is a war going on inside Israel. But this idea, this tendency towards violence, right? Mass shootings seem to be on the rise in the United States, and the question is, why is that? What's driving that? And so, surrealists, Freud, also, and part of psychology, is trying to understand this. Surrealists are trying to understand this in art. What's driving this, and why are we so violent? Right? Here's his most famous work. This is called The Persistence of Memory. It's also known as Melting Clocks for obvious reasons, due to the melting clocks. But it gives us the sense of this dreamlike sequence, very similar to what we see with Chirico, with a kind of barren background, right? But this one is not inside the city as Chirico does. This one's out in Could be Sierra Nevada. I'm not really sure. Freud is from Spain. Maybe it's someplace in Spain. Give us this kind of dreary backdrop with this barren, dry rock in the background, and maybe some kind of indication of water in the center top. But as we take a look at this, we have to start unpacking the kind of dreamlike qualities of it, right? As we take a look at the tree, for instance, the tree is barren, it's empty, which gives us a sense that there's a lack of life in addition to this desert here. But also it's a little bit odd because it seems to be on what appears to be a desk. So either this desk is enormous or this tree is really tiny, right? So in context, they don't really fit, and so that produces this dreamlike, unreal kind of feeling. Again, he's trying to elicit what's happening within the mind. So he's painting his own imaginations, his own thoughts, his own dreams to explore who he is, and that exploration helps us to understand who we are, right? Is what's driving perhaps us. A couple other things to think about, right? The melting clocks is a passage of time, which is a reflection on our fear of death or our mortality, right? So this is kind of like the memento mori that we talked about in Baroque art. This is a reminder of our death. The fly on top of the clock and then the ants over here on top of the pocket watch also are symbols of decay, reminders of death, right? And then we have this figure down here. We recognize this looks like an eyelash, but we don't really recognize what in the world this is. It looks like it's some type of scroll or papyrus or I don't know, it could be some type of skin from an animal. This looks kind of like it could be a nose, but it also could be perhaps the bill of a duck. Maybe this is a duck's head. It kind of goes, we don't really know, right? And so the idea is that there's a lot of things in the world around us that we don't really know, that we're trying to make sense of. But the question is, can we really make sense of the world if we're so influenced by these subconscious desires that they're clouding our vision? They're shaping the way that we perceive the world. And so the question here is, what is reality? How do we get to it? And the answer, I think, for Dali is we have to really understand ourselves. We have to understand what's motivating us, because if we're just allowing these desires to to kind of wreak havoc without being aware of them, we're going to do things that we're not really aware of, right? So the idea that we talk about in the church is to be agents to act rather than being acted upon. I think that there's some principles that we can apply here in terms of trying to understand why we act the way that we do so that we can be more conscious of our choices, right? So getting us to think more about that by exposing, right, what's below the surface, our fear of death, our fear of mortality, the ideas that we realize subconsciously that we have only a certain number of days or minutes on this earth, right? This is what's interesting about this work and some of the other works that we've studied throughout this class, is how small it is. You never know, right? When you're studying something out of a book or in a classroom setting, you never know how big it is. And then you go and see it and you're like, oh my word, that is like a 5x7 note card. And so this one's not very big. This is my wife standing next to it at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Not very big, but it has a huge cultural significant impact on it. There's just a couple of close-ups of the ants. Again, I think a lot of my students have liked Surrealism because it looks more real. They struggle with Fauvism, they struggle with Expressionism, they definitely struggle with Dadaism and their critique. But a lot of them like Surrealism in terms of, this idea of it looks kind of real, but kind of not. And so they're kind of doing some interesting things. They kind of move back towards representational art, even though they're not really representing the visual world out there, trying to paint something that a bird can land on is the example that I keep returning to. But they're painting an aspect of it, right? Here is the Ghost of Vermeer, which we've studied this semester, the Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can be used as a table. So here he's paying homage to earlier artists from the Baroque era from Holland. and his lasting influence on recreating reality, right? It's a part of what Vermeer was focusing on, light and shading and how to create a realistic space, very intimate introspections into the lives of a one or maybe two individuals. He didn't do a lot of art throughout his life. He only did, a couple dozen works of art in total, but it left a lasting impression on how do we represent reality, right? And then I think it's interesting that Dali, who takes someone who's representing reality in such precise detail and then exposes that lack of reality within art, right? So I think he's paying tribute to Vermeer and his lasting influence. I don't think he's trying to be disrespectful, but I think he's also getting us to question about what is really real, right? What are expectations? This one's just a fun one. Taking, again, very similar to a collage that we see with Dadaism and loosely tied to Cubism and their synthetic idea of taking different objects and piecing them together in a collage. Cubists do that a little bit. There's a lot more kind of piecing together in Cubism, but similar ideas, right? The idea of a collage for a sculpture here, he just attaches a plastic lobster, to a telephone to create new meaning, to create new ideas. And again, to get us to kind of that jarring feel to it, something that's familiar and foreign to us. This would produce some type of pain if this was actually real. You're putting this up to your ear, you risk having that claw grab hold of your ear. So again, it's producing that kind of tension, that fear of pain that we associate with mortality. Thinking about swans reflecting elephants, I think this one's one that students really like, the idea of questioning reality and how we can have different levels of reality within a particular work. At the top of the water, at the center, we can see swans, and then we look below, they look exactly like elephants. And so again, he's getting us to question, is the world that we think we see really reality, or is this just our perceptions of reality? What's below the surface, right? So again, this is a dreamlike sequence. Here we see a man kind of looking off in the distance, searching for truth, searching for meaning. Perhaps this is a proxy for us, or a metaphor for us looking for truth, looking for understanding. But again, notice how the background is kind of barren, kind of desolate. Similar to what we see with de Chirico's Mystery of the Melancholy Street, although that one is in an urban setting. But this one is in this natural setting, but now even the natural world seems to kind of be barren, and we're looking to regenerate. We're looking for this idea of creation, and the next generation is maybe going to fix it. But here, the world around us seems barren, maybe because we have made it so due to our violent tendencies. And then we have this kind of sand right here, this kind of sea of ocean. This reminds me of one of the Pirates of the Caribbean, where Jack dies and they have to go to the underworld to get him. Similar to this idea, this kind of apocalyptic setting, right? But again, giving us odd images that we have to then unpack. We have to think about. It slows down our pace of our vision. Rather than taking a look at a Broke art and saying, yeah, that looks like a bowl of fruit, and then kind of moving on, we have to kind of think, what's going on here? What is this painting about? It slows down the pace of our vision, makes us question, it makes us explore, and it makes us think about the real world and how we're making sense of this, how our brain interprets information. I wanted to show you a clip. Salvador Dali was on a game show called What's My Line? And the game show is they have people come in with different occupations, and then the panel has to guess what is the occupation, right? So I like to show this just to humanize artists. Sometimes we think about artists and what they're doing and how they're being part of the avant-garde, and they're trying to do something new. And I think sometimes we think they are bad people or just dark and brooding. They're actually kind of fun, right? They're artists, they're human beings. So I like to humanize them. So I'm going to skip through this part. Oops, I skipped through it all. Let me get back. Okay, Salvador Dali coming in, signing his name. They're all going to be blindfolded because they recognize him.
All right, panel, as you probably have realized, there is an area of identification here that might be in appearance, costuming, name, some area of identification which would give you too much information, so you're blindfolded. I would just ask our guest if you are fully familiar with how we keep score.
Yes.
All right, then in that case, let's let the folks at home and our friends here in the theater know exactly what your line is. who must also be unnamed, is self-employed. With that, let's begin the general questioning with Arlene Francis.
Are you associated with any of the arts?
Yes.
Would you ever have been seen on television?
Yes.
Are you a performer?
Yes.
Would you be considered a leading man?
Yes.
I got to move in here. Actually, in the general context of the questioning, we would have to accept that all the affirmative replies, except perhaps the last one, are not misleading in any major degree. However, I think the last answer is misleading, and we could not accurately describe our guest as a leading man.
He's a misleading man.
Misleading man he is. 1 down and 9 to go, Mr. Sir.
Have you achieved eminence in some field other than television?
Yes.
Would it be the sort of exploit that might possibly reach the front page of a newspaper?
Yes.
Is it an exploit that's been on the front page of the newspapers within the past couple of weeks?
No.
No. 2 down and 8 to go, Miss Kilgallen.
Do you imagine that we're blindfolded because one or more of us would recognize you at sight?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Are you accustomed to appearing before audiences?
Yes.
When you appear before audiences, do you ever wear less than you're wearing now?
When you appear before audiences, do you ever wear less than you are wearing now? I would say that under certain specific conditions, it is not impossible that our guest would wear less than is being worn now, but it's not necessarily germane to what it is we're trying to arrive at.
Is that a yes or a no?
That is a kind of up and down yes.
Well, all right. Do you have anything to do with sports or any form of athletic endeavor?
Yes.
Ball conference.
I think Dolly's trying to explain to him how active art is, the process of creating art and performance.
No, I think it would be too misleading to suggest that our guest had a basic affiliation with sports. This is not to say that it is not within the compass of his enjoyment to indulge in this particular endeavor.
Thank you.
3 down and 7 to go, Mr. Lawford.
I'm still working on the last one. Do you appear continuously on television? By that I mean once a week or once a month. Can I see you?
No.
No. 4 down and 6 to go, Miss Francis.
Do you use anything in your hands for your job? Like a pencil or a typewriter or anything like that?
Yes.
Would you be considered a writer?
Would you be considered a writer?
Yes.
Yes,
He has written books. He's also a film director, so...
What we have to guess is an all-around man. Are you well known because of a book that has been published of yours?
Miss Arlene, if I may interrupt here, I would have to agree that we must consider that our guest is a writer.
We're going to agree that we must consider that our guest is a writer. We're going to consider it. You mean we're going to consider whether he is or whether he isn't?
No, this is merely actually to try and be completely fair. The talents of our guest are not encompassed entirely in this area of work.
Oh, then you can do several things. Truly, except sports.
That's a fair assumption, yeah.
Have you had... I'm terribly lost. Have you had something published?
Does our guest have something published?
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Does he write humorously?
Do you write humorously? Yes, and then I think is properly yes and no.
Could he, does he ever do any drawing like comic strips?
Do you ever do any drawing like comic strips?
Yes.
Yes?
Our guest says yes, he does drawings like comic strips.
Is there something quite unusual about our guest?
I missed that last one.
I just asked if there is something unusual because everything that he does, the audience laughs about.
No, there's nothing unusual. Actually, this sort of thing goes on all the time.
I'm going to pass to Bennett.
Mr. Cerf?
You are a human being,
Very much so, Bennett. Very much so.
and there is no animal or dummy out there with you.
That's right. There is no animal or dummy out there with him except perhaps...
I'm not talking about the master of ceremony.
That'll be all.
Have you ever written a book that was published by my firm?
Did Random House ever publish a book for you?
Yes.
And that'll teach you to make remarks about the master of ceremonies, sir.
Was this book published within the past year?
No.
No, that's 5 down and 5 to go, Miss Gilgallen.
Is it possible that we have not yet struck upon the major thing that our guest is famous for?
That is very possible.
He is still maintaining that he's a performer.
Well, yes, in the degree that he was asked if he had anything to do with the arts and then was asked if he was a performer, in that large context, we would have to accept that he was indeed a performer.
Well, yes, I'd love a conference, Arlene.
Was there a call for a
maybe
conference?
have a conference, John?
You may have 15 seconds for a conference, and I'm going to give you 1 minute more to get it.
Ask if he could use his mustache to paint.
Have you a mustache that is rather well known? In fact, could you be almost caricatured just by that?
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you, Arlene. Are you Salvador Dali?
Salvador Dali is right.
I think sometimes we just think that art and artists are too serious, and we don't really see the humanity behind them. So I think it's good to see this. And now that we're getting into the 20th century, we have more footage, video footage of artists that we can turn to and see what they were really like, what their personality was. Rene Magritte, we've taken a look at one of his works already. Let's take a look at a couple more of them because he questions this idea of reality even further. Magritte was a Belgian painter and one of the first major surrealists in Belgium. His mother's suicide when he was 14 deeply impacted him, and he sought to capture the hidden forces that direct human actions, right? It was common with other surrealists. He was influenced by Cubism, Futurism, and Expressionism. He played an important role in the foundation of the preliminary literary Belgian surrealist group in 1926. Words and text begin to play an important role in the paintings as a way to provoke an analysis of conventional assumptions, as in the treachery of images that you see on the right-hand or the left-hand side, in which a precise image of a pipe is accompanied by the inscription "Ce n'est pas une pipe," right? So this is not a pipe. This draws our attention to the essential difference between an actual object and its representation in 2 dimensions. And so the idea of it's not a pipe, it is a representation of a pipe. Painting is a representation. It's not reality. It's a representation of reality. And I think that, we hear that and we're like, yeah, that's obvious, right? But I think in some ways they're suggesting maybe it's not so obvious in terms of art history, in terms of the greater context of trying to create something to be realistic, to be the most real. They're suggesting, why is that our drive? Why is that the the main driving force of art, when we can think about art as a product in itself, as part of the larger cultural discussion. And that is important, not just its visual beauty, not just whether it's pretty, that it has this larger commentary and it fits in with the larger socio-political paradigm. Thinking about the false mirror, I think this furthers this idea, right? Everything we see hides another thing. We always want to see what is hidden. So again, peeling back, getting underneath the surface. And the false mirror here, again, is part of the uncanny, something that we recognize, the eye, we recognize the sky, but in context together, it produces a jarring feeling for them. And the fact that he titles this one, The False Mirror, suggests that we tend to use our senses, sight, sound, hearing, taste, touch, in order to make sense of the world. Aristotle said through natural science, through the senses, we can understand the world around us. Well, what if the things that are going on mentally for us distorts the way that we perceive these kind of sensory images? Our sensory images can be fooled, and they're fooled constantly. And so we maybe need to stop relying on them so much, or at least understand how they can be fooled, to be able to understand the world, to get us closer to truth, that the exterior world can be deceiving. So the idea of an eye, something that we use to perceive the outside world, can be a false mirror. It can lead us astray. We can think that we're getting closer to truth, but we might not be able to, because we're influenced by our biases and whatnot, right? So again, this one is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City as well. Just to give you the sense of the size, this one's a little bit larger than the Persistence of Memory, but not much, right? But it has a huge, cultural significance. This one is jarring, I think, to a lot of people, not to be reproduced. We have a mannequin standing in front of a mirror, but instead of reflecting the face, which is what it should do, it reflects another back of the head of a mannequin, which produces this uncanny, this disorienting feeling. And again, as we think about, our vision, or as we think about the way that we see the world, when we go to a mirror, we're expecting to be able to see the world reflected. We're expecting to see ourselves. We're expecting to see our environment, what surrounds us. However, again, these ideas can be fooled, so maybe we need to stop putting so much faith in them, because they can lead to things like World War I, World War II. They can lead to a lot of destruction, because people can be blinded by their own biases and misperceptions, right? Misunderstandings. And then this one, I think, is another one of his more famous works. And here we just see the Son of Man. This is a self-portrait. And it's interesting that he titles this the Son of Man, which has different connotations. It has religious connotations to Christ. But I think here he's presenting himself as the everyman, right? So this idea that this is humanity in the modern world, demonstrating the modern conditions, the modern difficulties, limitations that surround us. But instead of revealing the entirety of the face, there's an apple, which also has historically religious connotations to it in terms of religious iconography of the apple and the tree of knowledge. And so what blocks us from seeing truth, what blocks us from seeing his face, is our reason, is our ability to use our senses to make sense of the world. Now, those things can be deceived, so therefore they can cloud or block the way of us seeing truth or seeing reality. It blocks the way for us to see him, right? I like this quote by Magritte. He says, "At least it hides the face partly. Well, so you have the apparent face, the apple hiding the visible, but hidden, the face of the person." It's something that happens constantly. Everything we see hides another thing. We always want to see what is hidden by the way we see. There is an interest in which is hidden and which the visible does not show us. This interest can take the form of quite an intense feeling, a sort of conflict, one might say, between the visible that is hidden and the visible that is present. right? So again, it's getting us to think about those ideas in terms of how we see the world, and getting us back to the idea of the religious context of this ongoing discussion about knowledge, truth, understanding, wisdom, intellect, right? The question that we have seen, right, this idea that knowledge, reason isn't always a positive thing. Maybe it's a little bit more endures on the far right-hand side. But in Jan van Eyck's the Ghent altarpiece, or Michelangelo's the Sistine Chapel, generally represented as being pushed away from God. And I think he takes a similar stance, but makes a different argument to that. Reason, intellect can blind us from seeing deeper truths, and we need to be a little bit more leery, or a little bit more critical of our own thoughts, our own ways of seeing the world, because they can be wrong, right? Mary Oppenheimer, thinking about other surrealists that are out there. She was a Swiss painter and sculptor. She exhibited with the surrealists at the Salon of Surreal Independence in 1933, then participated in surrealist meetings and exhibitions until 1937, and again more periodically after World War II. Her participation ended shortly before Andre Breton's death in 1966. Andre Breton was another surrealist, did some poetry, surrealist poetry. Thinking about my nurse. Again, we recognize the shoes, we recognize the plate, we even, maybe some of us, if we've seen this in older pictures, I don't think we see this so much anymore, whenever they would roast a chicken, they put little things on top of the feet. As they presented it to make it look more presentable. And so we recognize that. We recognize even the binding, right? But in context, in together, they produce a different feeling. They produce a disorientation effect for us with this sculpture, right? And I think maybe she's exposing this idea of, the expectations for women. The expectations, interestingly, for a nurse, right? So you have to be practical, and at the time you had to go around and perform medical procedures, but have to do so in high heels, which is not very practical to be on your feet all day. So the idea of the expectations of being presentable and looking a certain way on the outside versus, right, what the actual need is to provide medical service. And so it's producing some of that disorienting effect. And as she puts these shoes on a platter, makes it us aware of how we can often not see an individual, not see a human being, and we see instead something else, like a piece of meat that's being presented to us. And so getting us to think about that connection, that disconnection. But in terms of the overall surrealist movement, fitting in with the idea of getting us to question the way that we perceive the world might be flawed. This is her most famous one. This one is Luncheon and Fur. And so what she does is she puts fur around a teacup, a saucer, and a spoon, providing new context and new meaning. And now they no longer serve the original function, right? So again, it's produced a disorienting effect, because we can only think what it would be like to have herbal tea or hot chocolate in a cup with fur in it. It would be extremely impractical. Again, it's getting us to think about reality and our way of perceiving reality, right? And then this is just me next to it at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And just right behind my shoulder is where they have Dali's Persistence of Memory. A thought to think about, right? As we bring our discussion of surrealism to a close, what do you think surrealism wants to call attention to? How is this similar to Dadaism in terms of their questioning of logic, of questioning of reason, questioning of making sense of the world? And then also, in what ways is it different, right? So compare and contrast these two movements that are responding to World War I and kind of in between World War I and World War II, and thinking about this social upheaval, this idea of being lost and adrift, trying to make sense of the world around us, trying to make sense of the 20 million who died during the war, and the fact that the war was really essentially meaningless because no one really, quote unquote, won the war. it made it feel pointless. And so people are struggling to come to terms with these newfound socio-political institutions and trying to express that confusion, that doubt and uncertainty. So think about how are they similar and then how are they different, right?